Hi, Betty. How are you?
Oh, I'm well. It's nice to meet you. I've seen you before, but I haven't actually had a chance to speak
It's
with you before.
well, it's great to meet you. I'm sorry we didn't get to speak earlier. We were just a few minutes before going on, but I want you to know how much my friend Betsy and I have enjoyed your book, and I'm really looking forward to this book talk tonight.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it also, and I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I
A
hear you.
labor of love.
I hear you've had great acclaim lately, and that I was also told at our bookstore anyway that your book is one of the top three sellers in our bookstore.
Oh, oh, that's wonderful to hear.
Yeah, yeah, I was pleased as well.
The other ones are Ibram Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and um, Drew Lanham's memoir.
Oh,
So you're in good company.
I'm in very good company.
Let me adjust my lighting here. So I'm going to say a quick hello for everyone, and then Elizabeth's going to do a little bit of an intro, and then we're going to have a great reading by you. That's what I hear.
And lots of questions, I hope.
Oh, I'm sure of that. Yeah, no, I'm sure of that. And our participant count is clicking up now to 51.
Mm.
Would you like to wait a few minutes before we start? Are we already on broadcast?
Oh, it is just 6 now. Or 7 now. I have to do the time. It's 5 here. It's at 7 there now.
Yes, yeah, just turned to 7. So maybe we'll wait just a minute or two so we don't miss anybody. Okay. 52. It's like watching my favorite slot machine to see how many of our friends are here.
Where is your favorite slot machine?
I have news for you. Any slot machine is my favorite. How can you beat it? They make noise. They talk to you.
They steal your money.
Well, yeah, well. You just have to know how much not to put in.
Right.
Okay. Well, I guess, would you all like to begin? Sure. Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. I appreciate all 55 plus of you being here tonight with us. I'm Roy Young. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer at Montpelier, newly appointed just maybe 10 weeks ago. It's been quite a ride, but I would tell you one of my greatest pleasures is to meet all of our supporters and our staff members and the members of our communities. And one of those communities, of course, not only is our scholarly community, but our descending community. And so I'm thrilled that tonight's book talk represents many of those communities. And it's really sort of a symbolic end to what we're thinking of as a whole week of observation and celebration with Juneteenth. And so I wanted to introduce Bettye Kearse to you and Elizabeth Chu. Elizabeth Chu is our Executive Vice President and Chief Curator. And Betty, of course, is a good friend of ours and supporter and scholar and member of our descending community. And so I'm thrilled to welcome both of you here tonight to Betty's book talk. And I would like to let all of our 63 now participants know that if you put questions in the chat, we'll be happy to organize those and ask them of Betty a little bit later. And as well, Elizabeth and I have a few questions to begin the conversation. So without further ado, Elizabeth, would you introduce Betty?
Yes, thank you, Roy. It is a pleasure to have all of you gathered with us virtually. I see many familiar names in the list of attendees, so hello and welcome all. I have the honor this evening of introducing Dr. Bettye Kearse. Betty is a writer and retired pediatrician who spent her career with her own pediatric practice in Boston. Her writing has appeared in numerous publications. Her work was listed among notable essays in the Best American Essays of 2014. Since 1990, as the 8th generation Griot of her family, the keeper of memory in the history of her ancestors, she's traveled around the US, Ghana, and Portugal to, as she says, enable her family's story to take its place in recorded history. She first came to Montpelier in 1992 and was the first descendant of those enslaved at Montpelier to make herself known to the Montpelier staff. It was just 5 years after Montpelier opened to the public. She's returned many times since then for gatherings, programs, and to serve on advisory committees on the interpretation of African American history at Montpelier. Her image and voice appear in the Mere Distinction of Color exhibition. We have worked with Bettye on research, and we're very proud to have been a tiny part of working on the book. So the book, The Other Madisons, The Lost History of a President's Black Family, came out on March 24th. We were planning even before that to have an event at Montpelier. So it's very wonderful to have you all here tonight, and it's my great honor to welcome Bettye.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Would you like me to start with a reading, or would, okay. All right. Though the April weather in the foothills of Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains had been erratic, on the day of my return, the sky was clear and blue, and the sun was just beginning to warm the morning air. The distant, densely forested mountains that spread out before me were blue, almost purple, and so wide they wrapped around the horizon. Spring here, I thought, was alluring with its promise of warmth and sense of awakening. Summer, with its broad fields scattered with a colorful collage of wildflowers stretching from the mansion towards the hills, had not yet arrived, but already I imagined autumn's soaring trees ablaze with red, orange, and gold leaves. I foresaw rolling outlines of silver white winter snow rising gently along the hillside towards the sky's changing hue. Beyond the crest, snow glided down the slopes into the black lace of naked dormant trees. More than 2 centuries earlier, Mandy, Corrine, and Jim had witnessed the seasonal drama here. Despite its ever-changing beauty, Montpelier had been a prison. The landscape around the mansion was sweeping and open, but I felt the confinement of the plantation's antebellum years. Once, scores of slave cabins lay south of the mansion, and I pictured them scattered low on the hillside, leaning perilously, their weathered roofs giving way to the pull of the dusty earth. The sinking roofs mimicked the bowing hills, all succumbing to the forces of the land. Meanwhile, slaves, diminutive in the distant fields, toiled, their labor coaxing riches from the soil, making possible the Madison legacy.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Can we start by asking you to tell us the stories of the 3 ancestors that you mentioned, Mandy, Corrine, and Jim?
Yes, Mandy was my family's first African ancestor in America, and also my family's first Griot, that is our first oral historian. Corrine was her daughter by James Madison Sr. And Jim was the son of Corrine and James Madison Jr., the man who was to become the fourth president of the United States. And what I'm not saying here, and I will back up and say, was that Corrine came about and Jim came about when a powerful white man raped the most vulnerable person in America, and that was an enslaved woman. And in my family, the word rape has been very difficult to use, I think because it's just a very painful word. And so the term that was used in my family was visiting. I've been told there's another term that's called trespassing, when the man who perpetrated this crime, and I can only call it a crime, when that man was not the owner, but some other person, some other white man, it was called trespassing, because that man was trespassing on the master's property, meaning he was trespassing on the women owned by the master.
In the book, you really beautifully and poetically envisioned the life of Mandy. How did you work on that prose, and how did those images and words come to you?
When Mandy speaks, I feel those are the strongest parts of the book. And in fact, they were the easiest parts of the book, because the more I learned about her in my research and my travels, the closer I felt to her. So after a while, not a very long while, I knew what she wanted me to know, what she was saying to me, and what she wanted me to pass on. So I never heard voices, but the knowledge in her words was very clear to me. And I just wrote it down.
And so your book is really as much about your journey with the story as the story itself. How did you, as a girl in California, how did you first become aware of your family history?
Well, my first memory of hearing about the president and his slave was as a 5-year-old. My mother would make fancy dresses for me. She was quite the seamstress, but she was also a perfectionist. So it would be sew a seam, try it on, pin a hem, side it, and it just went on. And I would get very restless. And my mother would, in fact, I would even sneak away, but my mother would call me back and say, Betty, please, always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president. And that statement is our family credo, which has guided us for at least 200 years. And by repeating that credo on those occasions when I was misbehaving a little bit, she was not only telling me how she expected me to behave, she was telling me how proud she was of our ancestors, both white and Black. And, over the years, as I grew up, I would hear the stories again and again. When I was a child, the stories would calm me down and focus me and get me to stand still while she was sewing. But as I grew up, I came to understand the meaning, behind the credo. But in 1990, that's when I became responsible for the stories. That year, my mother traveled from Oakland, California to Boston, Massachusetts, where I was living at the time, to bring to me an old cardboard box filled with family memorabilia. And when I asked why now, worried that there was something wrong and she was ill, she said, it's time. I want to give you plenty of time to write the book. So my first reaction was, I can probably write a book. I had always loved to write. But I was concerned that I was not the right person. For one thing, I knew what griots were. So griots are the women who, for thousands of years in Africa, West Africa in particular, have spoken the histories of their people and told the stories of their ancestors. And by the way, their male counterparts are called griots. But these griots and griots, through their words, have preserved entire cultures and their values and their beliefs for thousands of years. So I recognize this as quite an awesome responsibility and wasn't sure I was wise enough to fill it. The other thing, though, I knew was that oral history was very, very important, especially in African and African American communities. The tradition of oral history was not left behind when slaves were captured and brought to this country. Because without this tradition, if they hadn't brought that with them, I would not have been able to know that I'm a descendant of an enslaved cook and her owner and half-brother, President James Madison. So those were two kind of feuding bits of knowledge. But another thing that made it difficult for me to believe that I was the right person to take on this responsibility was because by then I was old enough to really know what the credo was implying. And as I said before, a powerful white man had raped a vulnerable Black woman. So I wasn't sure I would be able to hold up that torch of family pride and history, especially the pride. I didn't know why the credo should make me proud. And so that's why I began my journey of discovery of not just my ancestors and our country, but also of myself. And so I decided to confront the whole story, including the discomforting parts. And so that's when I began a physical journey and also a psychological journey. Shall I continue, Elizabeth, or do you want to step in and ask a couple of questions?
Well, one thing so the family history comes from Virginia through into Texas, where your mother grew up and where her family was. So as a young girl in California, how did you first connect with your mother's Texas part of the story?
Well, this is part of the celebration of Juneteenth. And my family was in Texas, June 19th, 1865. They were in Central Texas. But to explain how they got there, it's sort of a long story, and I'll just do it very quickly. So I mentioned Jim, who was Corrine's and Madison's son. Well, according to our family stories, Jim and one of Dolly Madison's nieces fell in love. And when Dolly learned of that, she quickly sold Jim. And that's actually when the credo started, because Corrine, believing that Jim, knowing that he was a Madison, knowing the name Madison, could help them find each other someday. They did not find each other someday, but Jim remembered his mother's words. And so when he was taken away, he was actually sold twice. But the second time he was sold, he ended up in Tennessee, and he jumped the broom with a fellow slave there whose name we do not have, we do not know. He had children, and he passed on to those children the saying, always remember, you're a Madison. He too believed that the name could help them find each other, because it was quite common practice for slave owners to sell families apart. Just as Jim was sold, that was not an unusual thing to happen to enslaved families at all. So Jim taught his family his mother's words. And like I said, he had children. One of those children was my great-great-grandfather, Emmanuel. And Emmanuel he stayed in Tennessee for quite a while. In 1834, his owner purchased a wife for him, and her name was Elizabeth. And it's a very interesting document. I have the bill of sale, and what's so interesting about this document, I'm giving you a long answer to your question, Elizabeth, but it's just also fascinating and important to me. But what's so interesting about this bill of sale is that Elizabeth and Emmanuel had some choices. They were actually treated like human beings. They were still slaves, but they could choose whether or not they wanted to stay together after a year, and they could choose whether or not they wanted to live with his owner, who was Jephthah Billingsley, or her previous owner, who just sold her, Augustus King. Well, the family decided, or Elizabeth and Emmanuel decided to stay together. And so for my family, this document, this bill of sale, actually becomes a marriage certificate. So it's a very, very important document. So that was 1834, speeding ahead 14 years to 1848. Jephthah Billingsley transported the family from Tennessee into Texas. And so that's how they end up being in Texas in 1865. And by then, the Madison family, Elizabeth and Emmanuel, had at least 10 children, because we have an 1860 census that describes Jesse Billingsley, who was Jephthah's son, and the 10 children that Elizabeth and Emmanuel had. Now, there were no names there. There were just approximate ages and genders. So that's how we know. And there's no names. And what my mother did was her feisty self. She, wrote in the names and the birth dates, because the ages, as I said, there were no names. The ages were there, but they were kind of all wrong. They were just sort of guessed at. So anyway, that's the story of how my family was in Central Texas in Bastrop County on June 19th, 1865.
What was it like for you to go visit there as a child girl from California?
To visit Texas? Well, I didn't go often. My mother had some pretty painful memories from living in Texas, including she didn't watch a lynching, but she did see a man hanging from a tree as a young woman, and just the racism and just the danger of being a Black person in Texas or in the South. Periods, she just seldom went back. But when my mother did take me back, because she did want me to see my grandparents more. My grandparents came to visit us a little bit, but I think she wanted me to see where she had grown up and to sort of understand firsthand some of what it was like to live there. So in my book, I have this chapter, which is actually one of my favorite chapters, is Destination Jim Crow, about the time my mother took me there when I was 5 years old. And, it's a story of probably my first, well, it wasn't probably, it was my first introduction into Jim Crow, the Jim Crow South, and what it did. So just to give a quick sort of punchline, not giving away the story too much, I had befriended a white child on this train, and we were very close, but when we entered Texas, we were separated. We could not play together anymore. That ended our friendship, and that was my introduction, as I said, to the Jim Crow laws.
We have some questions already, so I'm going to turn to some of these. This is from Betsy Ryder. She says, you use the word family in the title of your book. In today's society, we use the phrase chosen family to describe people to whom we are emotionally close. Knowing what you know about James Madison, how do you feel about calling him family?
That's a really good question. I don't call him family, actually. I call him an ancestor. For me, family, they are the intimate people in my life. They're the people who brought me up and, who taught me my values and encouraged my beliefs and took me to church and sent me to school and bought me clothes and took care of me and directly contributed to who I am. Now, my ancestors are important too. The oldest ancestor that I know would have been my own grandparents, but I actually called them family because I did know them. Those before them, even white side, black side, I still think of as ancestors and know them as important to me as people along the years, through the generations, who are part of the stories, that I heard from the time I was a child. But yeah, I think that's a really good question and allows me to clarify, even for myself, the distinction of how I feel towards the people that I actually knew and saw and the people that I knew about.
Betty, I wondered if I could ask a question now, to be a little selfish here, but I've wanted to ask this of you. So I believe very much in the power of place. And I believe very much that every room that I enter, every place that I'm allowed, I bring all of my ancestors with me. And I'm guessing, based on your writing and your research, that's been part of your experience as well. So I'm curious, I know you've written about it, but I'd love for you to speak for a moment about the sensation of being here at Montpelier and feeling that as you entered these places, that you were bringing all of the people you wrote about with you?
Well, the first time I came there was 1992. And at that time, you had to take a shuttle bus across the road and up through we didn't have the visitor center in the way of getting directly on to the former plantation. So I stepped off of this shuttle bus, stepped onto the soil, and felt I belonged there. The moment I stepped on, I felt I belonged there. And then later on that visit, I had a very powerful experience. I met Lynn Lewis, who was the head of the archaeology department at that time. And she took me to see an archaeological site that had only been recently discovered. And it was the South Kitchen, which was some 70 feet beyond the back end of the mansion. And she showed me the rectangle of the borders and the pile of what had been the pile of bricks that had been the old hearth. And I could see Corrine there. I could visualize her being there. And then after she showed me that, she pointed out to me a groove in the ground that led it from the kitchen to the back of the mansion. And she explained to me that that groove had been worn there by generations of cooks who had served the Madisons. And so I stepped into the groove and traced the path from the archaeological site that had been the kitchen to the back of the mansion. So that meant that I could literally walk in the footsteps of an ancestor. And, that was a really, really powerful feeling and connection. Corrine was alive to me, and it was this, she was sort of guiding me along. So, yeah, and I've had other experiences on the grounds of Montpelier, and in particular the slave cemetery. And so the first time I came, I did not go to the slave cemetery. For one thing, I wasn't dressed appropriately. I had on sandals and shorts, and Lynn told me there was a lot of poison ivy there. And plus by then I was a bit overwhelmed by the day. I had walked in Corrine's steps. I had been near where, it was probably the last time she saw her son. And I was just kind of overwhelmed, and so I didn't go. And I'd also been to the Madison Cemetery, and so I had a lot of feelings going on. But years later, about 5 years later, I did come back. And again, Lynn and I were together, and she took me to the cemetery. And it didn't look like it did now. It was just sort of, there untouched. And so I was able to, walk through the dried leaves and among the trees, that were there. And there were a lot of rough pieces of quartz, big pieces of quartz, that were used for headstones and footstones. And I was just sort of walking around, Lynn and I being very careful not to step on these footstones and try to avoid where we thought the graves might be. And I looked at one particular tree and looked down, and there was a headstone that actually called me to it. The headstone and the tree were calling me to it. And I knelt down and touched it. And I didn't include this in the book because it sounds a little bit odd, because it was, it was a piece of stone, and I knew it was a piece of stone. But somehow I expected it to feel soft, like human flesh, because I felt that Mandy was lying there. And so when you talk about presence of place, it can be a really powerful, compelling experience.
Thank you, Betty. I appreciate you talking to us that way.
Here's another question from an audience member. He asks, what do you think the most important differences and similarities the Madison descendant families experience compared to other Black Americans? How does their origin, journey, and background differ or similarity meaningfully from other descendant communities, in your opinion?
So is that question, how does descending from a president differ from descending from other families who have similar backgrounds, like there was a male rape, or a female being, I'm not quite.
I'll read the first part again. What do you think the most important differences and similarities that the Madison descendant families experience compared to other Black Americans?
Okay, so just taking that part, I do descend from a president, but that is really not what's important. What's important to me is descending from slaves. The slaves were remarkable people, and most African American families do descend from slaves. Not all, but the vast majority do. And that is something to be tremendously proud of, because slaves were very strong people who had inner strength and a sense of hope that enabled them to survive enslavement, and in some cases thrive in enslavement. And they also possessed many talents by which they contributed in many, many countless ways to this country. And then when they died, those qualities did not die with them. They passed them on to their descendants, including those alive today. And that brings me right to the message of the book, what I really want the takeaway to be. And that is that it is my dream, really, that my book will encourage the slave descendants to embrace their slave ancestry and to reach deep inside themselves and grab onto and nurture their own inner strengths and hopes and talents, so that they too can make incredible contributions to this country. And I see it as a way of sort of staving off the effects of racism by have something to center on that can never be taken away from you.
Another
Next question, Elizabeth.
Yes. What was the most surprising fact or story you learned about through your family's oral history or your research?
The most surprising, well, I don't know if I was really surprised exactly. But my mother and I were very different in how we viewed our ancestry. So she was proud of having enslaved ancestors, because my grandfather was very proud of his enslaved ancestors. But she was particularly proud of descending from a president. And my mother brought me up, but we had really different feelings about it. So it took me a while to figure out why we were so different. And so she came up as a young woman during the Jim Crow period. And I came up as a young woman during the craziness, in a way. It wasn't really crazy, but it was very changing. It was very transforming, but much better term. So the transforming period of the social movements of the 60s. And so I was one willing to say the word rape for the first time in my family. I was the one to sort of face head on some of the more painful aspects of our family story. So, I guess it surprised me, though, just so different from my mother. Since we were, fairly close, we had our little mother-daughter tips, but yeah, we were fairly close. So, I don't know, somehow I just was a very different person.
We have two questions about about practicing history. The first one says, how are or have traditional historians who depend primarily on written documentation responded to your book based as it is on family oral tradition?
I haven't heard from any historians, but I have gotten lots of feedback from lots of different people, sort of thanking me really for offering this news, not that it's new, but bringing forth this perspective on America's history, sort of revealing and sharing sort of a new point of view, and giving voice to slaves and their descendants who they weren't recorded, they didn't have access to the written records, and as I say in the book, two of my ancestors were actually literate. But even if they had any kind of written documents, they didn't have any place to keep them. And as I say in the book, even their pockets weren't their own. So I think I might get some challenges from historians and other people, but so far I have not. So far people have just welcomed this new look, this new take, this more inclusive look.
Another one about practicing history. What resources, archives, museums did you use when researching your family history? What advice do you have for African Americans who want to trace their family history?
Well, I'm partial to oral history, and so I would first encourage you to pull the stories together. So find the elders in your family, whether they're in your home or if they're across the country. You can now reach them in any way you can. Then I would encourage you to look in places where things might have been forgotten. So very often, most people will store things in basements, attics, closets, and then forget about them. But I would encourage people to, sort of maybe send the kids to do it, send the kids on a treasure hunt, and try to find whatever items that belong to your family. You might find some letters, which are incredible sources of information. Or you might find something like an object, like an army uniform, which has a story behind it. And then try to find out that story and to write them down. Now, even though I'm talking about oral history, I'm beginning to think it's valuable to write things down, to record them and store them and keep them in a safe place, because things could get lost. In fact, in my family, the family Bible was lost, and we almost, lost some, we did lose some very valuable documents, but my mother was able to track down a lot of documents, and, by making phone calls and going to archives like the courthouse in Orange County, she was able to find things there. And then it's important to sort of put somebody in charge. You don't have to call them a Griot or a Griot, but somebody who's going to really perpetuate those stories and keep adding to the items in the box, and who's going to also choose the next keeper of that box. But, the question really was about archival information. I think Ancestry.com is fine. Just be careful that, you're really looking at the right family trees. My brother has quite an extensive family tree on Ancestry.com. But what he's finding is that people are using his work as a resource, and they're not contributing to his knowledge base. And then, of course, there are other courthouses around the country, but as I was doing research, I was really shocked by the number of fires that there had been in courthouses, especially throughout the South. And I can't help but think that some of those fires were deliberate. Who knows what was in those documents that were burned up. But and then if you're interested in DNA, you can do it in DNA, but it really has some significant limitations, especially those on Ancestry.com and some of those that use autosomal DNA. Yeah, they often miss a lot.
Here's a little bit of a different topic. This person says, I'm a graduate of JMU, 1977. Some believe, and JMU obviously is James Madison University. Some believe the name should be changed. What do you think, given your family history?
Oh, no, I don't think the name should be changed. James Madison Jr. was the third Secretary of State, the fourth president, the major contributor to the Constitution. He did a lot for the country. He made a number of very important contributions. Yes, I do think he was a flawed human being, but he was a human being. So some of that, just sort of, that goes with the territory. That's, I think, you can say he was hypocritical, but yeah, and yes, he was. But I think we need to look at the full picture. And I do think, and I mean the full picture, including, the negative parts.
This person would like to know, does your oral history include recipes or foodways from Montpelier, perhaps from other early members of your family?
Recipes? You are not asking the right person because I don't like to cook. But no, there are no recipes in the box. There are no recipes in the box. I may call my cousins and see if they have any.
Because Corrine was a cook, right?
She was, but there are no recipes in the box.
Here's a question that relates to African religion. Descendants from enslaved men and women in other parts of larger America, such as Brazil and Cuba, were able to relate their own gods to their descendants. Even today, they worship, and I apologize for my pronunciation, Ogun, Django, Lamanja, and so many others. Why were the gods of Mandy have not transcended over the generations? Why don't we know who they worshiped when they arrived in America?
I have a feeling about that. I don't really know. But my feeling about Christianity is that it offered hope to enslaved people. It gave them a sense of an afterlife, of something much better beyond than what they were experiencing in this life. They believed that Jesus was the ultimate guide for their lives and loved, their Black lives as much as he loved their white lives, put them on equal footing with anybody else who believed in Jesus. But I just think it gave hope and something positive and something really inspiring to look on. But I'm not speaking as someone who knows much at all about the African religions. I don't know about afterlife. I do know that griots were buried in a special way in Africa so that they would be prepared for life after death. But I don't know much else about it. I know that some religions do not believe in an afterlife, and I don't know if that applies to any of the African religions. Maybe someone else on this Zoom, in the Zoom meeting, knows something about that. I would certainly love to hear it.
Here's a short question. What were Mandy, Corrine, and Jim's last names?
Well, they were really Madisons, but not officially. I mean, no one in my family was officially had that as a last name until after emancipation, when formerly enslaved people could choose a name. And in my family, unlike many other families, they did not choose the name of their owner. They chose the name Madison, honoring Corrine's words. So no, I doubt that. I mean, they didn't have official last names. I mean, they just knew they were Madisons.
Someone is asking how to spell griot and griot.
Sure. Griot, the women, is spelled G-R-I-O-T-T-E. And the male, Griot, is spelled G-R-I-O-T.
Here is a very nice question from our colleague, Hillary Hicks. She says, Betty, how will you choose the next keeper of the box?
Oh, it's easy for me because I only have one child. So my daughter, Nicole, will be the keeper of the box. She lives in London right now, but she knows. And the question is now Nicole has two children. So she will have to make a choice between my grandson and my granddaughter. Yeah.
I had the feeling from your book that you were a little bit surprised that your mother chose you. Did you think she was going to choose your brother?
I didn't think about it. I didn't know. I think maybe I was in denial because, it is quite a responsibility. I mean, she told my brother the stories, but I was older. And I was also the one that was sort of imprisoned beside her sewing machine while she was making fancy dresses. My brother didn't have to go through that. So I think I heard the stories more than he did, and the credo more than he did.
The question that has to do with overseers. What, if anything, has your research revealed about the relationship between the enslaved community and the white overseer and craftsman class people who occupied the stratum between slave-owning elites and the enslaved?
So, can you repeat the question?
Sure. It says, what has your research revealed about the relationship between the enslaved community and the white overseer and craftsman class who were in the stratum between the slave-owning elites and the enslaved community?
Well, so on the one hand, you're talking about the overseers, which would have, their role would have been to make sure the slaves were doing what they were supposed to be doing in the fields or wherever they were supposed to be working. And so I think the relationship with them would have been sort of an uncomfortable one. This is a man who's keeping everybody in shape. And maybe not at Montpelier, because one of the overseers we know about was Sawney, who was a slave himself. But in other situations, I think, they would have been domineering, if not brutal. But then the question is also talking about people who are not slave owners, white people who are not slave owners, and how do they relate to the enslaved community, correct? Yeah, I don't know that they had much of a relationship per se. The plantations were fairly isolated, but white Americans, even if they were poor, weren't in danger of being sold and sent away. They had freedom, which, that makes all the difference in the world. And I'm certain they thought of themselves as above the enslaved community.
I can add to that our archaeological excavation for this season is at the site of the overseer's house, which is just sort of in front, sort of way far in front of the Madison family cemetery, below where the present day visitor center is. So we'll hopefully have much more information about the overseers and their space and their situation, which is a really important part of the story that is hardly ever told at plantation sites.
Yeah, I would be interested if in knowing that relationship. So, I mentioned Sawney, but were there other enslaved overseers?
Not to my knowledge. The site where we are excavating was from the sort of Madison's retirement years, and it was occupied by white mostly white overseers and their families.
Mhm.
Here's
So
another.
I would be interested in knowing how that person or persons interacted with Montpelier's enslaved
That's going to be a
community.
big part of the research of Matt Reeves and his team. So stay tuned. Here's a question about the box. What are some examples of items in the box and your favorite item?
My favorite item, oh, I don't have it right with me, but it's a picture of Elizabeth. I actually took it out of the box and I carry it around with me. Well, for a long time, I was carrying it around with me in my wallet. But people say, oh, don't do that. What if your wallet gets stolen? So what I finally did is I put that away someplace safe and I made a really nice copy of it and I carry it around. But Elizabeth is my great grandmother, and her image is, the most tangible. I mean, it's the only real picture I have. I have a drawing of Corrine, but that's being researched. Just if that really is Corrine. We're told it is, but it's a very odd picture. But in the box there are letters, and one of the letters I put in the box myself was, in fact, 3 of the letters, but they were to me from my grandfather when I was a baby, like at different ages. One was welcoming me into the world. Another was saying, why don't your parents put shoes on your feet, because your feet are going to start getting big and the boys won't like you. And another one is about shoes and about how he's telling me how when I came on a visit as a baby, I left my shoes there, and how he keeps them by his bed, even though he remembers my toddling in and waking him up. But those are the ones that are most meaningful to me. But the slave census that I mentioned is there. There's land deeds. Because when my great-grandfather Mac was freed, he was at first he was. I'm blanking on the word. He was a haver. He had to give half of his tenant farmer. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the word. But at first, so he used that money he saved every penny and was able to buy land. So, just owning land was such an important thing to my family. So I have the land deed that, there's lots of photographs. There's sewing samples. One of my great aunts was a seamstress, and she did intricate smocking, and I picked pieces of that. A dress that I wore when I was a baby. There's just a varied number of things in there.
On the topic of overseers, one of Montpelier's interpreters, Patrick Campbell, has reminded me that there was an enslaved man named Moses who was the overseer of Madison Sr.'s blacksmithing operations. So
I think I knew him as, no, I didn't know him. I knew of him as a blacksmith. So at one of the reunions of the slave descendants, there was a reenactment, and Moses was one of the characters. So yeah, I remember him. I didn't realize that he had been an overseer also.
He was also numerate and did the accounts for the blacksmithing operation as well. So here's a question about genetic testing. I read in your bio that you're a retired geneticist and pediatrician. Have you considered asking family members to have genetic testing done to confirm your relationship to the Madisons?
Well, I have considered it, and I got close once. So years ago, I don't remember exactly what years it was. It's been at least 10 years. So I was working with Dr. Bruce Jackson, he passed away a couple of years ago. But I was working with Dr. Jackson on trying to establish a genetic connection. And I got DNA samples from 3 of my male cousins. And they all matched. And then Dr. Jackson and I tried to get a sample from a member of the National Society of Madison Family Descendants. And Dr. Jackson was very rigorous about the genealogy. He said, you definitely do not want to get a sample from the wrong person, because then they could just say, see, you're not at all a descendant. So the society came forth with one man who said he was willing. But what happened was that I don't think he actually sent the sample. And I believe he didn't, because at around the same time, there was an article about me and my research in the Washington Post. And he didn't want to, be involved in the kind of brouhaha that was raging around the Jeffersons, the Hemings and the Jeffersons. So he backed away, and Bruce Jackson never received the sample. So I've tried. I have tried, and I will try again. But right now, as I said earlier, what's important to me is to encourage African Americans to embrace their slave ancestry, because that's really what matters to me. That's what makes me so proud to be, in this family.
How do you think the shift has come where people of your generation and younger are much more interested in finding the stories that your family has always been the keepers of the stories, but in some African American families that's not true? Why do you think that now there's just a much heightened interest in African American genealogy and family history?
Well, I think we can give Dr. Henry Louis Gates some credit. He has this TV show, Finding Your Roots, which is really an outstanding show. I just wish everybody on there were famous in some way or another, because we all have very interesting, inspiring family stories. But I think my generation and younger are farther away from the pain of slavery, and farther away from being embarrassed about it. I had my great aunt just wouldn't talk about it because it was just so uncomfortable. But I think that kind of feeling is waning, and I think just people are just more interested in embracing who they are, whether they are African American or whoever they are.
There's a quick comment that I'm going to turn into a question. Land is really important. How has land ownership factored into your family story?
Well, I mentioned that my great-grandfather, as soon as he could get enough money, bought some land. He bought 92 acres, and he farmed it. He made money, and a year later, he turned it around and bought 200 acres. So land was security. It was not just a source of income. It was a sense of having something that you could hold on to that could not easily be stolen. Now, granted, African Americans did get their land stolen, but there was a sense of belonging and just having something tangible and real. I mean, everybody felt more secure with land. It just meant so much. So, I mean, that is still the case. It's just now that land's gotten so expensive and rare.
So we are getting close to wrapping up. If anybody has any other questions, please type them in, or if you'd like to, oh, here we go. Here's a new one. Given recent events, one could say all roads lead to Montpelier, both in terms of educational opportunities on racial disparities and importance of the Constitution and its survival. That's more of a comment, but it is very interesting how much the current moment is sort of.
Well, I have a comment about that. I do. I'm working on a piece now that I'm trying to submit to different newspapers. And it is called the 1787 Constitutional Convention and the 2020 Murder of George Floyd. And so the Constitution certainly leads back to Montpelier because James Madison was the father of the Constitution. And what I'm saying in this article is that there are 6 clauses that deal with the enslaved people, but nowhere in the Constitution are the words slave or slavery. So in the 3/5 clause was written by the master of the Constitution of Montpelier, James Madison. The enslaved people are counted as 3/5 in terms of representation and taxation. And so that certainly gave the South sort of a political edge, especially in the House of Representatives. But more than that, it made concrete, it made explicit the belief that enslaved people were lesser. They're counted as lesser, so they must in fact be lesser. So that is one item. Of the other 6 items, did I say there were a total of 6? There's actually a total of 7. Of the other 6 items, 3 of those, I believe, set the groundwork for police brutality and what happened to George Floyd. So one of the clauses gives Congress the right to establish a militia that, among other things, can suppress slave uprisings. And then another of the clauses gives states the right to their own right, beyond what the federal government do, their own right to establish militia that can suppress slave uprisings. And then the third one is that the writ of habeas corpus applies to everybody except those who were involved in any kind of slave result. So some of the protections of the Constitution were denied those people. So I'm saying in this essay that our local police are the equivalent, I mean, they're are equivalent to local militia. And they still see themselves as they see their roles as that of keeping Black people in check, whatever it takes.
So that will be an essay to look forward to reading. And then I'm going to use this as a wrap-up question. What is, from a listener, what is your next book project?
My next book, okay, well, I'm working on a children's picture book about my family history and the importance of oral history. And then I'm also going to write a version of the Other Madisons, the lost history of the President's Black family, for young adults. This book actually, I think, was written for young people because I want them to be inspired. And I want them to, as I've said many times, to embrace their slave ancestry and to believe in themselves. But I wrote it to their parents, especially their mothers. But then I realized that young people need to figure this out for themselves. They need to think about it, read about it, think about it for themselves. So I'm going to do a young adult version and an early reader version too.
I'm going to sneak in one last one. This is really the last question. Are you comfortable saying how your daughter feels about being the next caretaker of the box?
Oh, am I comfortable? Saying, I think she's ready. I think, I haven't really asked her that question because she doesn't have a choice. But I think she's okay. I really think she's ready for it. And I am eager to see what her take on it's going to be. Because as I've said, mine is very different from my mother's. And I imagine my daughter's will be very different also.
Bettye, I want to take a moment to thank you on behalf of all of us for sharing your book with us and sharing your history with us. And I think there were many moments tonight where you were sharing all of your ancestors with us as well. So we really appreciate that and honor that. And thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. I really feel honored to be able to do this and to share it with you. And as I've said over and over, every chance I've gotten, Montpelier has been wonderful to me. From the moment I set foot on Montpelier soil in 1992 to this moment right now, the people at Montpelier have been supportive and helpful and encouraging and have believed in me every moment.
I'm glad.
Well, one of the first weekend after we closed, we were supposed to be having a book party. So I'm thrilled we're finally able to do it. And people from all over the place have been able to join us. So thank you everyone who joined. Keep your eye on our upcoming virtual programs and join me in thanking Bettye for her generosity and her beautiful words.
Yeah. Much luck, Bettye. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night.